In the summer of 2003, on a gravel road at the edge of Harlan County in eastern Kentucky, a 41-year-old woman named Josephine Mattick spent $847 on 14 lengths of secondhand black polyethylene pipe, a gravity-fed drip irrigation kit she'd ordered from a supplier in Tennessee, and 3 dozen bare root seedlings of a variety of apple called limbertwig that almost nobody in the county had planted in 40 years. She loaded everything into the back of her late husband's Dodge Dakota herself. The nursery owner in Barberville had offered to help her tie down the seedlings. She thanked him and did it herself. She drove back the 30 miles to Harlan on Route 119 with the windows down and the radio off. Her neighbor, Boyd Tackett, was splitting wood in his side yard when she turned in. He saw the pipe sticking out of the truck bed and the bundle of bare root saplings wrapped in wet burlap. He didn't say anything, but he watched her unload. That was the beginning. In Harlan County, beginnings don't stay quiet for long. You need to understand who Josephine Mattick was before you understand what she did with those apple trees. Because what she spent the next 5 years doing on her 8 acres on Clover Fork Road only makes sense if you know where she came from and what she had already lost. Josephine was born in 1962 in a coal camp house 3 miles up a holler that doesn't have a name on any map. Her father, Cleet Sorrell, worked underground at the Benham mine until it closed in 1987. And after that he kept a garden that was half subsistence and half stubbornness, a 1/4 acre of beans and tomatoes, and a small orchard of maybe a dozen trees, mostly yellow transparents, and a pair of old limber twigs that his own father had grafted onto rootstock sometime in the late 1940s. Cleet Sorrell was not a talkative man, but he was a noticing man. He could look at a hillside in February and tell you what it would do in May. He kept weather records in a composition notebook from the dollar store in Middlesboro. He had notebooks going back to 1973. When Josephine was old enough to walk the orchard with him, he made her slow down, not to look at the trees, to look at the ground under the trees. A tree tells you about itself, he told her once, but the ground under it tells you whether it'll be here in 20 years. He showed her the difference between soil that held moisture and soil that shed it. He showed her what a root zone looked like when the grass under a tree was managed versus when it was ignored. He showed her things she didn't have words for yet, but stored somewhere she couldn't name. Josephine married Dennis Mattick in 1990. Dennis ran a small sawmill operation off Route 38 and had inherited 11 acres from his uncle, rocky hill ground mostly, with a good flat section along the creek bottom that had been in hay for as long as anyone could remember. They built a house on the flat section. They talked about doing something with the hillside acres for years. Dennis died in January of 2001 from a blood clot that formed after knee surgery and traveled in the night without warning. He was 44 years old. Josephine found him in the morning when she woke at 6, and he was not in the bed. He was on the kitchen floor. She called 911, and then she sat on the floor beside him and held his hand until the ambulance came, because she would not leave him alone in the cold kitchen. After the funeral, Dennis's brother drove up from Knoxville and spent a weekend walking the property with a real estate agent from Harlan. He suggested she sell the timber rights to the hillside and maybe the bottom acres too, take the money, move into town. Josephine thanked him for coming. She told him she had things to see to. He drove back to Knoxville. She went out to the barn and looked at the hillside for a while. She managed the property alone for 2 years before the apple trees. What Josephine saw when she looked at those hillside acres really looked the way her father had taught her to look, was not what other people saw. Other people saw rocky, thin-soiled slope ground, good for maybe some timber, not much else. What she saw was that the south-facing sections caught sun from 8 in the morning until nearly dusk. She saw that the old fence row running along the top of the ridge broke the worst of the north wind. She saw that the soil in the middle elevations, where some old clearing had let leaves accumulate for decades, was darker and softer than anyone would guess from the road. She had been reading, not the extension service pamphlets that came in the mail, though she read those too. She was reading something different, a quarterly journal out of Asheville, put out by a nonprofit focused on Appalachian food heritage and traditional orchard systems. She'd found it at the public library in Harlan when she was looking for something else entirely. The journal described something called a mountain orchard system, a way of planting fruit trees on hillside terrain using the natural contour of the land to capture water, with specific attention to the old varieties that had evolved in the eastern mountain climate over 2 centuries, and that were drought-tolerant and disease-resistant in ways that commercial varieties simply were not. The idea was not complicated. It was almost stubbornly simple. You planted along the contour. You planted the right variety for the elevation and the aspect. You managed the grass under the trees not by mowing it flat, but by letting certain species grow as ground cover and slashing them back twice a year, so they built organic matter rather than competing for it. You did not irrigate in the conventional sense. You captured the water that already fell on the hillside and slowed it down long enough for it to sink in instead of running off. The reason eastern Kentucky hillsides looked scraped and compacted was not the soil itself. The soil had been some of the finest in the region a century ago. The reason was what happened after the timber came off and the coal roads went in, and nothing was ever planted to hold the slope. Water ran down instead of soaking in. Organic matter left with every rain. The soil that remained got thinner every decade. Josephine had watched this on every hill she'd ever known. She just hadn't known before that you could reverse it. To plant along the contour on a hillside, you needed to mark the contour lines. You did that with a simple A-frame level made from 3 pieces of lumber and a plumb bob. She built hers in the barn on a February afternoon in 2003 from scrap 2x4s and a piece of string. The polyethylene pipe wasn't for irrigation in the usual sense. It was for directing the water that came off the steeper sections. Above her planting area, slowing it, spreading it across the slope before it gathered enough speed to carry her soil with it. She started on the south-facing section, not drove 3 rows of trees planted on the contour, 11 trees total, with the drip lines running along the slope to keep the young trees alive through the first 2 summers while the root system's established. She put in limbertwig because her father's trees had been limbertwigs, and she had eaten the apples in October her whole childhood. She put in a few winesips because an older woman in the Asheville Journal had written 3 pages about winesaps on south-facing slopes in the mountains, and every word of it matched what she was seeing on her own hillside. What the neighbors couldn't make sense of was the pipe. Boyd Tackett was the first to notice it. Black pipe running up the hillside in long arcs that didn't follow the slope the way a normal drainage line would. It curved. It went sideways across the hill. It disappeared behind the tree line and came out again 50 yards to the left. Boyd mentioned it to his wife, Norma, who mentioned it to her sister at church. The story started at the Feed and Seed on East Central Street in late October of 2003. Denny Combs, who had run the place for 20 years and knew the business of every farmer and gardener in the county, had seen Josephine's truck on Clover Fork Road 3 times in 1 month. Always with her, heading up to the hillside, with tools and pipe, and what looked like a bundle of sticks she was treating like something precious. He mentioned it to Pete Slusher, who ran a small cattle operation on the other side of the ridge. Pete had actually pulled off the road one afternoon and watched Josephine for a while through the tree line, not understanding what she was building. "It's irrigation pipe," Pete told Denny, "but she's not running it down the hill. She's running it sideways, like she doesn't know which way water goes." Denny laughed. A woman at the counter laughed. 2 men waiting on a parts order laughed. And that was the beginning of the story that would travel, the way stories travel in Harlan County, from the feed and seed to the diner to the church parking lot and back again. The story went like this. Josephine Mattick had taken it hard when Dennis died. That was understandable. Nobody said otherwise. But she'd gotten hold of some idea from an Asheville magazine, and she was up on rocky hillside planting apple trees in the most unlikely ground in the cline, running water pipe sideways across a slope, and talking about soil like it was something you could fix instead of something you were stuck with. Apple trees on that hillside. It didn't add up. Nobody in Harlan County had made a go of a hillside orchard in living memory, and there were good reasons for that. Reasons that a woman who'd spent her life in the county should have known. The story was told without malice. People liked Josephine Mattick. She had her father, Cleet's reputation for being quiet and straight and good for her word, but she was alone now, and she was doing something that didn't look like it would work. And it was worrying. Boyd Tackett told his brother about it at Thanksgiving. His brother mentioned it to a man he worked with at the county road department. By spring, if you drove past the Mattick place slowly enough, you could see the young trees on the hillside, small bare switches with a little green just starting, and the black pipe running its strange sideways course above them, and you might shake your head, because the whole thing just didn't look right. In the second year, 2004, Josephine added a hand-drawn map of her hillside pinned to the wall inside the barn door. She had marked each tree with a number, its variety, its planting date, and the aspect of the slope it occupied. She tracked which trees had set fruit the previous season, how much fruit, and what condition the tree was in going into dormancy. She was also tracking the ground under the trees, using her father's method, walking each row on foot in early spring and writing down what she saw: the moss coverage, the worm activity at the surface, the depth to which a piece of rebar went when pushed with moderate hand pressure. What she was beginning to see, and she was careful about this because she knew how much she wanted to see it, was that the soil under the oldest planted row was changing, not dramatically, not in a way she could have shown someone from the road, but the rebar was going a 1/4 inch deeper on average than it had at planting. The grass species under the trees had shifted. The coarse fescue she'd started with was giving way in patches to something finer and denser. She found earthworm castings in the second row at places where she had found none the year before. She didn't say anything to anybody. She wrote it down. She was also on the phone, some evenings, with a woman in Letcher County named Agnes Pelfrey, who was doing something similar on her own hillside, and with an older man in Wise County, Virginia, named Thomas, who had been planting heritage varieties on contour for 11 years. These conversations were long and specific. What do you do when a wet spring pushes your grass growth faster than you can slash it back? What's your timeline before you see the soil shift? How deep do the roots need to go before the tree can survive a dry August without the drip line? Josephine's phone bill was higher than it had ever been. Norma Tackett noticed because she worked at the utility co-op office in town and saw the account totals when she processed payments. Norma told Boyd. Boyd told Pete Slusher. The black pipe in the phone calls merged into one story about a woman who had disappeared into an idea that had come from somewhere else and didn't belong here. The laughter at the diner on Cumberland Avenue was not unkind, but it came reliably. By 2005, if you mentioned Josephine Mattick's apple trees at the Feed and Seed, people smiled before you got the next word out. There were two things happening on the Mattick hillside in 2005 that nobody driving past on Clover Fork Road could see. The first was the trees. The trees in the oldest row were not just surviving. They were establishing in a way that Josephine recognized from her father's orchard, but hadn't dared expect this quickly. The limber twigs were putting on 18 to 24 inches of new growth in a season, which was strong for a young tree on hillside ground. Their color was right. Their bark was right. In the late summer, she walked the rows and pressed her thumbnail. She walked the rows into the secondary branches and felt the resistance she was looking for. These were trees that had found water on their own. The second thing was the soil. Josephine had started doing a simple jar test on soil samples from 3 different sections of her planting area. You put a measured amount of soil in a jar, filled it with water, shook it, and watched how long it took to settle. Clay-heavy, compacted soil settled slowly and left a thick, turbid layer. Soil with good aggregate structure, with organic matter and fungal activity working through it, settled faster and left the water clearer. Her upper rows were settling faster than they had at planting. Not dramatically, but measurably. Something below the surface was changing. Her cattle also grazed the hillside, 6 head of mixed-breed stock. She had always run them on the flat-bottom pasture. In 2004, she began rotating them up onto the hillside sections between the tree rows, moving them in and out on a schedule, using them to graze the grass short before she slashed it, letting the manure work into the surface. She had read about this combination, trees and managed grazing, working together on hillside ground, and she had asked the man in Wise County about it. At length, he told her it doubled the speed, the speed of the soil change if you did it right, and could set you back a season if you did it wrong. She was careful. She moved the cattle before they could damage the tree roots. She moved them before the grass went below 3 inches. She didn't mention any of this at the Feed and Seed. She didn't mention it at the diner. She had her father's understanding of these things, which was that a person who talked about what was working had a way of talking it into stopping. You waited until it was undeniable. Then you said what you had to say. In the spring of 2006, a woman named Sandra Younts from the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension came to Harlan County, doing outreach on sustainable hillside land use. She had been calling county extension offices across the eastern part of the state, asking if anyone was doing anything worth documenting. She had gotten a call back from a retired extension agent in Harlan named Don Ferris, who had heard about a woman on Clover Fork Road with apple trees on a hillside and black water pipe running sideways and thought it might be worth Sandra's time. Sandra Younts drove out on a Tuesday morning. Josephine met her in the driveway and walked her up the hill. Sandra was in her 30s, careful, the kind of person who writes while you're talking and asks you to go back to the beginning when you assume she's already following. She stood in the oldest tree row for a long time. She dug at the soil surface with a small folding knife she kept in her jacket pocket. She looked at the grass composition under the trees. She asked Josephine to take her through the planting layout, the contour lines, the pipe system. She asked to see the barn map. She looked at 3 years of tree records and the rebar measurements. She was quiet for a while. Then she asked if she could bring a soil scientist from Lexington in the fall. Josephine said yes. The soil scientist came in October. His name was Walter, and he had spent 20 years studying degraded slope soils across the Appalachian region. He took cores with a machine. He brought in the back of a university truck. He spent 2 days on the Mattick hillside and half a day on the comparable slope behind Boyd Tackett's property line, which Boyd let him access without asking too many questions. Walter called Josephine from Lexington in November. He was careful on the phone, the way scientists are careful when the numbers are doing something they hadn't anticipated. He told her that in her 3 oldest rows, the organic matter content at the 4-inch depth was 2.1% above baseline for degraded hillside soil in her elevation range. The aggregate stability, a measure of how well soil particles clumped and resisted erosion, was significantly higher in her rows than in the adjacent unmanaged slope. He had found mycorrhizal activity in her root zone that he had not seen in degraded slope soil of this classification in 20 years of coring. There was a pause. "What does that mean practically?" Josephine asked. "It means the soil is rebuilding," Walter said. "Faster than I would have predicted. What you're doing is working." Josephine thanked him, wrote the numbers in her notebook, put the notebook in the filing cabinet with the tree records. She didn't call anyone. She went out to the barn and stood in the doorway, looking at the hillside, in the dark. She had been waiting 3 years for someone to put a number on what she thought she was seeing. The number was real, but it was a drather's daughter. But she was her father, and she kept not saying anything because the thing hadn't proven itself in the one way that would matter most. That way was a dry summer. The dry summer came in 2007. June was dry across most of eastern Kentucky. July was worse, the driest July in Harlan County since 1999. The hillsides across the county went brown by the 3rd week of the month. The shallow-rooted grass on the steeper, unmanaged slopes compacted as the soil shrank and the cattle that grazed those slopes punched through the dry surface with their hooves. On some of the hillside ground in the north end of the county, you could see bare dirt from the road by the 1st week of August. Josephine's hillside browned. She was honest about this with anyone who asked. Her trees went into drought stress, and she knew it from the slight cup in the leaves at midday. But they didn't drop their leaves. They went dormant, slowly, at the top of each branch first, the way a tree drops load from the outside, in, when the root system is deep enough to keep the core alive. The grass under her trees went tan, but did not disappear. The ground surface, built up over 4 years of organic matter accumulation, held its structure even as the moisture left it. She pushed her rebar into the soil in the oldest rows during the 2nd week of July. It went in. It went in because even in a dry July, the aggregate structure that had built up held pores open that the old compacted soil would have slammed shut. Her 6 cattle lost condition that summer. She was not going to pretend otherwise. But they did not lose weight. She had moved them off the hillside in June, earlier than usual, when she saw the July coming. They grazed the bottom pasture, which had more organic matter in the soil than it had when Dennis was alive, because she had been managing it differently for 4 years. And the bottom pasture held through July when the fields on either side of her property went to stubble. She didn't sell a single animal that summer. 1/3 of the cow operations in the north end of the county sold early into a soft market to get ahead of a feed bill they couldn't face. Boyd Tackett had been watching. Boyd had watched for 4 years. He was a careful man who didn't talk much about what he was looking at until he had decided what he was seeing. He pulled his truck over on Clover Fork Road on a morning in the middle of July and sat for a while with the engine running and the window down, looking at the Mattick hillside. The trees were stressed. He could see that. But they were standing. The grass was tan, but it was there. He drove home and told Norma he thought maybe Josephine was onto something with those apple trees. Norma didn't say anything. She had been thinking the same thing for a year. Pete Slusher drove past twice in August. Pete had been one of the first people to laugh about the sideways pipe back in 2003. He had good eyes. 30 years of farming had given him eyes that didn't lie to him even when he wanted them to. What he saw from the road did not make him feel good, which was the feeling of having been wrong about something, in a way that had cost him nothing personally, but that he would have to sit with anyway. He didn't stop. He told himself it was a freak thing. Some years just went different. The story at the Feed and Seed in August of 2007 was different from the story that had run there for 4 years. Denny Combs told it one more time. Josephine Mattick and the sideways pipe and the apple trees, nobody thought would make it. But this time the laughter was shorter. A couple of the men at the counter didn't laugh at all. A woman buying grass seed asked where exactly on Clover Fork Road the Mattick place was. In September, Sandra Younts came back with a camera. She spent 3 days on the hillside. She photographed the soil cores. She photographed the tree rows and the grass underneath them. She photographed the adjacent slope on Boyd's property line for comparison. She published an article in the Extension Service's regional newsletter in the spring of 2008. Josephine Mattick was named. Josephine had thought about it for 2 weeks and decided yes. In November of 2007, the Harlan County Farmers Cooperative held its winter meeting at the community center on the edge of town. 42 people attended. Somewhere in the middle of the agenda, when the business about market prices and equipment co-shares had been handled, a man named Lawrence Breck, who ran the biggest haying operation in the south end of the county, said he'd been reading about something called a hillside agroforestry system, some kind of combination of trees and managed grazing on slope ground. He'd seen a flyer from an organization in Asheville. Did anyone know anything about it? The room was quiet for a moment. Boyd Tackett said, "That's what Josephine Mattick's been doing up on Clover Fork for the past 5 years." He said it flat, like a fact. And then he looked toward the back of the room where Josephine was sitting. 41 heads turned. Josephine looked at Boyd. She looked at Lawrence Breck. July, she looked at the flyer in his hand, which was from the same Asheville nonprofit whose journal she had found in the Harlan Public Library in 2002. "How long?" Lawrence Breck asked. "Since 2003, she said. "Spring planting." The room settled the way a room settles when something everyone half knew becomes something no one can pretend not to know. "I'd like to see it," Lawrence said. What happened over the next several months was not a parade or a ceremony. There was no afternoon where the county gathered and someone made a speech. What happened was quieter, and because of that, more permanent. Lawrence Breck came out on a Saturday in March. He was a man who looked at land the way he looked at equipment, assessing, checking for what would hold and what would break. He walked the tree rows without saying much. He asked about the contour layout, and she walked him through it. He asked about the pipe, and she explained the water management. He stood in the oldest row for a while with his hands in his coat pockets. "My grandfather used to say you could judge a farm by what it did in a bad summer," he said, "not what it looked like in May." Josephine waited. My hillside ground looks the way this used to, he said. He made a call to a heritage nursery in Virginia that same week. Boyd Tackett came by in April without calling. He found Josephine deadwood from the tree rows, and he helped her without being asked, working down the row in the quiet of the morning. When they were done, he stood and looked at the hillside. I watched you for 4 years, he said. She waited. I told Norma you'd planted those trees in the wrong ground, he said. I told Pete Slusher the pipe was going the wrong direction. I know, she said. I'd like to talk to that woman from UK Extension, he said. Sandra, she's good, Josephine said. Ask her what Walter found in the soil cores. Pete Slusher was last. Pete had laughed the most, and driven past the most times, and had said to his wife, as recently as the previous December, that the whole thing was a novelty that only looked good because the trees were still young. Pete Slusher came to Josephine's door on a Sunday morning in June of 2008, with his cap held in both hands in front of him. He stood on the porch. My hillside's giving up, he said. Yours isn't. Josephine held the door open. Come in, she said. I'll put coffee on and show you the records. The summer of 2008 was the confirmation. July brought 10 days without rain after a wet June, and it was a dry July, and the wet-to-dry swing was hard on every slope in the county. The hillsides that had been carrying continuous cattle pressure for years showed it by the second week. Bare patches appeared at the upper elevations. Rills cut in the heavy rain that came in the third week of July. On 2 properties in the north of the county, the rills deepened into gullies before the rain stopped. On the Mattick hillside, the trees held. The oldest row, now 5 years in, had root systems that had followed the moisture gradient deep into the slope. They shed their top leaves in the dry stretch and kept their inner canopy. The grass under them, 4 years of accumulated organic matter and mycorrhizal network, held the surface together through the heavy rain that followed. There was no erosion above the tree rows. The pipe did what it was built to do. By that fall, Denny Combs at the Feed and Seed had ordered his first shipment of heritage apple rootstock. He put it by the front window, where you'd see it when you walked in. 3 people asked about it in the first week, without him mentioning it to anyone. Sandra Younce submitted a paper in early 2009 to a regional journal of sustainable agriculture. The paper was titled Hillside Soil Recovery under Contour Agroforestry and Managed Grazing in Eastern Kentucky, a 5-year observation. Josephine Mattick was cited by name. She appeared in 3 photographs, standing in the tree rows, standing by the barn map, standing at the soil core site with Walter. In February of 2009, but it was a dry July, the Harlan County Farmers Cooperative held a special session called by Lawrence Breck for the specific purpose of hearing from Josephine about what she had done and what it had cost, and how a person might start. 51 people came. That was 9 more than had come to the November meeting. Josephine had not prepared a speech. She had her barn map, which she had taken down and rolled under her arm. She had Sandra's preliminary paper. She had her father's composition notebook from 1977, which had nothing to do with contour planting or heritage varieties, which she brought for reasons she didn't fully explain, even to herself. She stood at the front of the community center and unrolled the map and started from the beginning. She was a dry July. She was not by nature a person who talked in front of rooms. She had not done it before in her life, but the map was not a speech. It was the same kind of thing her father had shown her on those walks, one thing at a time, plainly, in the right order. She told them what the hillside had looked like in 2002. She told them what she had been reading and why it had made sense to her. She told them about the contour method and the pipe, and what it cost, the $847 to start, and what it had cost each subsequent year. She told them about the soil cores and what Walter had found. She told them about July of 2007 and what she had and had not sold. When she finished, Lawrence Breck asked the first question. Pete Slusher asked the second. Boyd Tackett didn't ask a question. He looked at his cap in his hands and nodded slowly. The questions ran for more than an hour. Josephine answered all of them. She said, "I don't know," 4 times, about specific things she genuinely didn't know, and each time she wrote down the name of someone who might. Near the end, Denny Combs, who had started the story 4 years ago at the feed, and seed and had been the one to keep it running, raised his hand. "Josephine," he said, "when you were up on that hill in 2003 and 2004, with the pipe running sideways, and everybody in the county figured you'd made a mistake, did you ever wonder if they were right?" The room was quiet. Josephine looked at Denny for a moment. "Every time it didn't rain," she said. "That's why I kept the records. Nobody said anything. That kind of quiet is different from other quiet. It stays." By 2011, 6 properties in Harlan County were running some version of a contour tree system on hillside ground. Not all of them, not all of them were doing it the way Josephine had done it, and not all of them were getting the same results. Because the results required patience in a way that most people understood in theory and struggled with in practice. But 6 properties were trying. Lawrence Breck was one of them. Boyd Tackett planted his first row of trees in the spring of 2010. He used limber twigs, the same variety Josephine had started with, because he had tasted the apples from her oldest row in September of 2009 line and had not tasted anything like them in his memory. He told his wife they tasted like what apples must have tasted like before everything got changed over to the commercial varieties. Norma asked what that meant exactly. Boyd thought about it. He said it tasted like the apple knew what hill it was from. Pete Slusher was methodical once he committed. He called Josephine in the evenings with questions about timing and grass management, and whether you needed to adjust for a west-facing aspect versus south-facing. Their conversations were long and specific. In 2 years of calling, he never once heard her say anything that sounded like a "told you so." She just answered the questions. He respected that more than he was able to say to her face. Sandra Younce's paper was accepted in the summer of 2009 and cited in 3 subsequent papers on Appalachian land restoration. Walter came back to the Mattick hillside in 2011 with graduate students, 2 of them. He spent a week. He told Josephine before he left that he was going to use her site as a comparison reference in his next decade of research. She told him she'd leave the gate unlocked. In the spring of 2012, the University of Kentucky Extension Service listed the Mattick property as a demonstration site for hillside agroforestry in the region. They organized a field day in April. 63 people came from across 5 counties, parking along Clover Fork Road and walking up through the gate. Josephine met them at the gate and took them to the oldest rows first. She walked them through the tree rows one at a time. She showed them the barn map, 9 years of records now, pencil on the same butcher paper she'd started with, supplemented with the composition notebook she'd filled. She showed them where the first limber twigs had come in full bearing in 2007. She let them push rebar into the soil and feel the difference between the managed rows and the adjacent unmanaged slope. An older man from the eastern end of Letcher County, a farmer in his late 60s who had run cattle on hillside ground for 40 years and had watched it get a little worse every decade, pushed the rebar into the soil in the oldest row, and then walked 5 steps to the unfenced edge of the property and pushed it into the slope outside the tree line. He stood there holding the rebar in both hands for a while. "Same mountain," he said finally. "Same mountain," Josephine said. 9 years. The man was quiet. He looked at the tree rows, at the dark grass underneath them, at the limber twigs that had grown from bare sticks into trees that threw shade in April. "My daddy ran cattle on this kind of ground for 35 years, he said. "He thought the hill just did what it did. You either got lucky with the weather or you didn't." "Mine too," Josephine said. "He watched it as carefully as any man I've ever known. But he didn't know what to do about what he was watching. Neither did I until I started reading." "What did you read?" the man asked. She told him. She gave him the name of the journal, the name of the organization in Asheville, the name of Agnes Pelfrey over in Letcher County, who was 3 years into her own hillside and would talk to anyone who called. She wrote it on the back of a seed catalog card from her jacket pocket. The man folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I've got 40 acres on the south slope I've been trying to figure out what to do with for 20 years, he said. He looked at the oldest limber twigs, the ones that had come through the July of 2007, without dropping a single branch. "You think it's too late to start?" Josephine looked at him. "It took 9 years to get here," she said. "You might not see all of it." She looked at the tree row, at the grass, at the soil that was not the same soil it had been in 2003. "But you'll see enough to know it's working, and that's the part that changes how you look at a hillside." The man put his cap back on. He looked at the trees for a while longer. They stood there in the April light. 63 farmers, and one woman who had started with $847 and a secondhand pipe kit and a quarterly journal from Asheville and 4 years of being the story that